In this video, I'll go over authorization. Although you'll probably hear the terms authorization and authentication used interchangeably, they're actually quite different. First, authentication asks the user who they are and verifies the user's identity so they can access a system. Authorization is what comes after this. It verifies the user's permissions to determine which specific resources the user is allowed to access to. Authentication is validated using login credentials, and authorization is validated using an access control list, or ACL. An ACL is a list of permissions attached to a resource, such as a file or folder. The ACL lists several entries known as access control entries, which are basically users or groups that have access to the resource. Groups allow for efficient administration and make security implementation easier. A new technology file system, access control list, or NTFS ACL, contains a DACL and an SACL. These are two distinct ACL types. The D in DACL stands for discretionary, and the S in SACL stands for system. So discretionary ACLs specify permissions, and system ACLs are used to keep track of who's accessing a resource and making changes to it. Another Microsoft term is security principles. Security principles include user accounts, computer accounts, and security group accounts. Each security principle has a unique security ID called a SID. The system keeps track of all SIDs so that when a user logs onto a Microsoft system, the system creates an access token for him or her. The access token includes the user account SID, the SIDs of all security groups the user belongs to, and a list of the user's rights or privileges. User rights are rights that specific users have on the system. These are also known as privileges, and they're defined by the local security policy or through the Microsoft group policy. When a user tries to access a resource, such as a shared folder, the user's access token with its SID is compared against the SIDs of the shared folder. If there's a match, the user can gain access to the resource. For example, let's say that Frank attempts to access the sales folder. When he does, the system reads the folder's ACL, which contains all users and groups SIDs that allow file access. When we look at the ACL here, we see that SID 5 has read access, SID 7 has read and write access, and SID 12 has full control. This means that it's probably an administrator account. When we look at Frank's access token, we see that he has a user SID of 3, and that he's also been assigned to Group 1, which has a SID of 7. So when the system compares his token with this folder's ACL, there's one match. Frank has access to the sales folder because he's a member of Group 1. No other SIDs match up, so Frank is only granted read and write file access. This is a simple example, but you get the idea. As a security administrator, one of your most important jobs is to control both file system and network resource access. You do this using permissions, privileges, and roles. Permissions, privileges, and roles are usually cumulative. As such, it's easy to inadvertently give someone access to something that you don't want them to have access to. When you assign rights to users, groups, and other accounts, you need to ask yourself, do I really want this person to have this access level? If your system supports the concept of a role, you can create a role definition. In some systems, it might be called a role object. A role is kind of like a template. You build a role, add the desired access, and then you can use that shell of an account to create new accounts as needed. For example, let's say that Sally is the payroll assistant. She's worked at the company for 10 years and has access to all the files and systems that she needs to be effective at her job. One day, Sally is promoted to payroll manager, and Frank is hired to take over as payroll assistant. If her user account was created from scratch, you'd have to start all over to redesign Frank's account. But if you'd created Sally's account using a role specifically made for payroll employees, you could use that same role to create Frank's new account. This makes things much easier and much more secure. We simply add or remove users from roles instead of having to remember which user needs which privileges added or removed. Whatever system you're using, you need to remember that each user receives all member groups' access privileges in addition to its own specific assignments. Cumulative access can get out of control pretty quickly. Over time, users end up with too much access to the file system. The best way to reduce this problem is to limit a single user's assigned number of roles. Take Sally and Frank, for example. Currently, they're both in payroll, but now that Sally is a manager, she needs access to additional employee information, like salaries and financial history. You could solve this by leaving Sally in her current payroll employee role and adding her to the HR role. By doing this, though, you're probably giving her access to too much information. She obviously needs access to salary information, but she doesn't need access to employee reviews or disciplinary files. Instead, you should probably create a payroll management role. If you're dealing with a situation where none of the roles provide the access level needed for a given user, it's a much better option to create a completely new role that has the necessary access level instead of assigning that user to multiple roles. That's it for this lesson.